Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Cherry Audio Elka-X tutorial series. Today we're going to do a preset deep dive. We're going to take this stock sound, this jar-o laser sound. We actually began the tutorial series with this sound. I'll give you a quick listen again to it. It's a fabulous unison bluff sound made famous by Jean-Michel Jarre in his Rendezvous album. We're going to deconstruct this sound, figure out how it works, and this really pulls together a lot of the stuff that we've learned in this tutorial series and really helps you to understand how I kind of deconstruct the various synthesizer components, and hopefully it'll help you to think about how to construct your own sounds and maybe even get a couple of tips on how to add colour to your own presets as we figure some stuff out about this sound. Now, every synthesizer has its own kind of unique DNA, and once you figure out what that DNA is, it helps you to basically plot a course on how we're going to deconstruct these presets. Now, we know that the Elka-X is a dual layer synthesizer. We've basically got two synthesizers stacked on top of each other. And so the very first thing I'm going to do before I go any further at all is solo those layers. At the moment, we're looking at the lower layer, and I'm going to click layer solo, and I've thrown the entire upper layer away. We'll worry about that later. All I want to hear now is what the lower layer sounds like on its own. Very different sound. It's obviously still got many of the primary characteristics of the sound, but that's going to help us to really zone in on this layer without the kind of the audio confusion that the upper layer would bring to us. So let's start having a look at what this layer looks like. What are the primary characteristics? Well, we already know it's a double sound. We've thrown one of the halves away, and it's unison. So I know that no matter how many keys I press on the keyboard, I'm only ever going to hear one note, but more importantly, those notes are going to be stacked. And because we have some unison detune, we know that they're going to be offsetting pitch, and that immediately is going to inform the colour of the tone. So let's hear exactly what this unison detune is doing to the sound. I'll play a single note. So there's the unison detune at 0. What you're hearing now is the multi-oscillator aspect. We've got two oscillators playing together here, and so you're still hearing a complex sound, but this is with all of the detune taken away. Now I'll throw one of the oscillators away. Let's throw oscillator 2 away first. And finally, we have a stable waveform. If you look at this oscillator and your waveform is absolutely static, you know you've thrown all modulation away, got no unison detune, we've got no oscillator detune, which is another kind of aspect of unison detune, and we've got this simple waveform, which looks like that. So let's have a quick look at oscillator 1. How is it making it sound? It's 16 foot, so it's basically the lowest bass register. It's a sawtooth wave, don't care about pulse width. So now I want to know why that waveform isn't a simple sawtooth. Quite a lot more complex than a simple sawtooth. And the answer is because there are 8 voices stacked on top of each other. If I go into single mode, now we've got a simple sawtooth. But when you stack all of those sawtooths together, this is an analog instrument. If it was a digital instrument doing everything kind of technically perfect by the book, you would simply get a bigger sawtooth. But because it's an analog instrument and there's natural internal inconsistency between those 8 different voices, when we switch to unison mode, you get that extra complexity of all of those very, very slightly different sawtooths being stacked on top of each other. When we throw into the mix the extra unison detune, now all of those sawtooths are waving against each other. They're all slightly out of pitch, slightly out of tune with each other, which means there's constantly changing constructive and destructive interference between their various waveforms, and you can see it dance in the spectrum analyzer below. See all of these waves dancing up and down, that's the various constructive and destructive. Every single sine wave has its own little kind of plot on the chart. Let's have a listen to oscillator 2 now. Pull 1 down, 2 was at 7 as well, let's turn that up. Okay, now in addition to the sawtooth unison detune, most of the settings of the oscillators are pretty much identical. got some extra colour going on there. There's a filter sweep. So our first thing is to jump over to the multi-mode filter and see if that's what's going on. But there's no envelope. It can't possibly be the filter envelope that's generating that filter sweep. But because we've already deconstructed this synthesizer, there's a second place that we can immediately look as well. And that's the portamento section. Not somewhere you would ordinarily look, but because of the idiosyncrasies of this synthesizer, we know that we have this glide button. And glide essentially generates a unique per key envelope. I'm drawing this shape because that's basically the shape of the envelope that's going to get drawn every single time I press a key. Here's our glide amount, set to 31 semitones, basically as high as it can go over 2.5 octaves. Every time I press a key, you get in this massive sweep on the key. Now, it's a filter sweep, it's not a pitch sweep. When we have a look at the glide settings, it's tied into oscillator 2. So ordinarily, your first thought is, well, that should be starting off with a very high pitch and jumping down 31 semitones, but it's not, it's a filter sweep. And so once again, the only inference we can draw is if we're doing an oscillator sweep and we're hearing a change to the filter, we know that the oscillators must be synced. And sure enough, oscillator 2 is synced to oscillator 1. If I disengage sync temporarily, I'll press a key. There's the pitch sweep I was expecting to hear. But because we're in sync mode, oscillator 2 doesn't get to determine its own pitch. Oscillator 1's doing that. I'll turn the glide off for a moment and let's do a filter sweep of oscillator 2 via the tuning control. It's not as dramatic because the pitch sweep is smaller. It's actually quite difficult with the transpose knob. I really want to transpose down and I can't. The quirks and weirdnesses of oscillator 2 sync, if you actually tune up far enough with oscillator 2 transpose, it's drawing enough mini waves inside oscillator 1's resets that it can actually kind of reclaim some pitched control of its own. Listen to this. There we go. Because it's literally drawing 2 mini waves inside oscillator 1's every wave redraw. That was quite a big detour. Let's get back on track. Because I've made quite a few changes to the preset there, I'm just going to get back to my original basic sound and switch into solo mode again. Let's have a look at the LFOs next. We'll deal with LFO 1 first. Now both depth controls are set to 0%, but that doesn't necessarily mean the LFO is not doing anything. It is patched in. Got a triangle waveform directed to oscillators 1 and 2 and to the filter. There's absolutely no harm turning depth A up to hear what this modulation sounds like. It's oscillating quite quickly, and obviously it's going to modulate the pitch. Here we go. So it only took me a few seconds to have a little look at that control, and I've now got a brand new thing that I can do with this preset, take it off in a new direction, add some pretty cool, quite fast vibrato to the sound if I want. Depth B is currently mapped into the filter. That's going to take a bit more work to get going because the filter envelope is currently disengaged, but let's give it a go. There we go. So with the filter frequency turned all the way up, it was pretty difficult for this oscillator to do anything, but all I had to do was bring the frequency cutoff down. And that's quite a cool strobing kind of filter effect. Very good. Since they're not currently in use, that's all we're going to have a look at, but just again, another one of those little things to take note of. You see a control map to something, turn it up, see what it's doing. LFO 2 next. There's a very small amount of modulation wheel control. It's set so small that it's actually going to be difficult to hear. And what I'll do is I'll press a key, I'll turn the modulation wheel up, and I'll bring this slider up so that you can hear it and then bring it back down again. So here's the key on its own, no mod wheel. Turn the mod wheel up. You can hear that filter. Let's turn it up more. Now you can hear very fast oscillation. But when it's down at very subtle levels, 10%, it's just, again, an extra little bit of tonal colour. All of this stuff adds up. Never discount anything completely. If it's in use, it's adding some colour to the sound. Again, I'll throw all those changes away, get me back to my simple lower panel. There are no effects units in use on this sound, and so we're done for the lower control. Now we can go over to our panel control and press upper and switch over to the other layer. Now we can deconstruct this one. Let's have a listen to it. Turn my mod wheel down. So it's much easier to identify that change in the upper layer. See, the LFO2 is assigned to both layers, so it's acting, this oscillation is acting on both sides, and on the upper layer it's having a much more dramatic effect. So it's doing something on the lower side, but not much. Don't forget that there's an entire different layer to look at. So we've got that glide again, exactly the same as on the lower layer. Glide is assigned to oscillator 2. I'm going to turn that off so that we've got a more stable sound to listen to. And we can see that the fundamental layout of the oscillator structure is very similar. We're in unison mode. Oscillator 2 is once again synced. But if we toggle between the lower and upper panels, you can see that the upper panel is set to 8 foot and the lower panel is set to 16 foot. So even though they're describing all of the other controls in both oscillators, as I toggle backwards and forwards between them, really easy way to compare two layers is to just click the buttons and see what's different. And in fact, the only difference, apart from the fact that they're at different octave ranges, is that the upper layer has some transpose on oscillator 2, a tonal control. It's synced, it's hard synced, so this is a tonal control. What else have we got going on? Once again, neither envelope is in significant use. If the attack is at 0 and the sustain's at maximum, basically the envelopes aren't being used. There is a long release on the amplifier envelope that's giving us a large part of that sound. And on the upper layer, we've also got an effects unit. So this is where our delay, our ping pong delay is coming from. We're synced to the host tempo. And it's actually a large part of the sound. There's a lot of feedback here. If I turn it off. So it's really thickening the sound up a lot. On the low frequency oscillator, the light's not lit. That doesn't mean the low frequency oscillator's turned off. In fact, you can't turn these low frequency oscillators off. It just means it's cycling incredibly slowly. 0.02 hertz. That's what, 50 seconds to complete a single cycle. What that actually means is if I turn up the depth on this low frequency oscillator, we're going to get a really massive, slowly evolving sweep. You can see it in the oscilloscope. You can hear the pitch changing as well. What was the original depth control at? I actually didn't look before we went into the preset, so let's have another look. Jump back to my original starting point and we'll hover over depth. 0.1%. It's on. It's actually doing a very, very slight pitch modulation over such a long period of time that you have to hold the note down an awful long time for it to happen. Like I said earlier, everything matters. Even 0.1% is not zero. Depth B is, however, completely disengaged. This is once again a filter control, and if it was on, so we've got a single frequency rate here for both depths. This is a massively slow filter sweep, but all we have to do is turn this knob up and give ourselves some headroom on the frequency cutoff, and we're going to get access to it. Let's turn that back down again. Any other differences between the two layers? Let's toggle backwards and forwards. I've just seen the different speed of the glide portamento. So this is the longest possible portamento that we can have. And that's what's giving us that enormous filter sweep. Over all that time, if I speed it up, it's much easier to catch. That's what we're getting. So these two different layers, whilst performing very similar roles, they're split in octaves and they're doing subtly different things. We've got a different rate of filter sweep on the portamento, on the glide aspect of the portamento. The low frequency oscillators being configured differently. The fact that the upper layer has delay and the lower layer doesn't. So when we bring those two layers back together again, they're really complementary because they're doing really similar things, but just sufficiently different to give you that massive scope of sound. So that'll do us for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.